Welcome to those of you online. Man, the Zion King really is a great intro for what I'm talking about. I mean, it really is my sermon intro in a sense today because I have two sons, son, daughter, son. I have two sons and a daughter. And honestly, when I think about our kids growing up in this world, I don't want them to just survive. I want them to thrive in this world. But I also want them to be a blessing to the entire world around them, the people around them in every way. But honestly, when I've thought about that a lot, and I think specifically about gender, I mostly think of my daughter. I know that we have a male-dominated society, and historically that's been the case. And I know that historically there have been men who have oppressed others and all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot about my daughter. Like, I want her to be safe. I want her to be strong. I want her to be godly. I want her to know her dad loves her. All these things. And so I really understand. Ladies are undervalued in our culture and society. So I want that to be really clear. I have thanked God for a church that values women. I love how many strong, powerful women we have at Momentum and in my family. I love that. And so I just want to say that today is really about how equally God also wants his church to be filled with strong, powerful men. And I'm going to look you in the eye today and say without hesitation, that's the case. Without hesitation, God wants strong, powerful men in his church also, along with those strong, powerful women. Brent Hansen, who's a Christian radio personality and an author, he's a very insightful, deep-thinking dude, but he's also really funny. Some of you, if you've been around, might remember 2 years ago, we did a series called Unoffendable that was based on his book. And at the end, I did a Zoom interview with him about his book and talked to him about it. And just an absolutely great guy. Really, really funny dude, like I said. But anyways, he has a new book that was just released. It's hot off the press called The Men We Need. Man, I'm only a little ways into the book, several chapters in. My son Zion just finished it, by the way, which is really cool. He loved it. He's like, I think I'm going to read it again. And so, great book so far from what I've seen. But he says this early in the book. He has a section where he talks about how he doesn't feel like the typical manly man, okay? And he says this. He says, I'm not, how to say, the most intimidating manly of all possible men. Let's put it this way. I don't even hunt. I play the accordion. He said, I'm not good at grilling. I don't even really enjoy camping. Oh, I play the flute too. He said, I wanted to play football in high school, but I had to quit. And I'm not making this up because they couldn't find a helmet big enough to fit my head. He said, I'm pretty fit, but not jacked. I have 0 tattoos. He could have got an airbrush one at the festival yesterday. He said, I'm an avid indoorsman. That's my favorite. We got some spinach up here. Can you get that on MoChurch.tv? He was in mid-sip. I'm an avid indoorsman. I own puppets. He said, this is not going to be one of those books that's all about how if you want to be a real man, you got to go out there and take down a moose barehanded or free solo a vertical cliff. I can't even free solo stairs, he says. And so this is how I think most men feel. Is like, okay, whatever my picture of a manly man is, I'm really not that. And most men feel like that. I know fix-it kind of dudes who are like handy-manny, who just feel like, I don't feel like I'm like what I expected to be, like a man to be like. I know avid sports fans, people who are sports stars in high school, maybe even college, who just feel like, I don't know that I'm a dude's dude, you know? I mean, it goes on ex-military. I don't know that I'm what you'd picture as a man's man. So when I say this morning that we need strong, powerful men, that comes in all shapes and sizes, okay? And I think that alone is good news for men. Most of us don't feel like we're the most intimidating, masculine, all that stuff. Most of us don't feel that way. So go to Acts chapter 16. You can about download the Bible app for free to get there. We're in the series out of the book of Acts in the Bible that's about the earliest Christianity. And in the series, we're looking at some of the different types of people that were impacted by the gospel, the good news story of Jesus, his cross, and his resurrection. And so in today's story, I got to give you a quick background, but we have talked about some of this in past sermons. Basically, there's 2 Christian men, Paul and Silas, and they have just cast a demon out of a young slave girl who is being exploited by her masters. She's clairvoyant, and she can fortune tell. And so they cast a demon out of her, and when that happens, her masters are hacked off because they're like, we just lost our money-making ability with this girl. She's no longer as valuable to us. We were exploiting her for money, and now that this has happened, she can't tell fortunes. She can't do fortune telling anymore. So they're mad. So they grab Paul and Silas, and they drag them before the city magistrates in the ancient Greek city of Philippi. And so that's where we're at right now, and it says this in Acts 16, starting with verse 22. It says, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they, Paul and Silas, had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, the jailer, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in stocks, it's a form of torture, basically. It causes cramping in your arms and legs, and it's pretty awful. So they're beaten publicly without a trial, is what happens here, and they're unlawfully imprisoned. I mean, all this stuff, these are flagrant violations of Roman law, and that comes up later in part we won't cover, but that comes up later. But it says this continuing in verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. Now, I recently covered this part of the story up to this point in 2021 in a sermon called Jailhouse Rock. You can listen to that on YouTube. I covered that earlier, but I didn't focus on this next part much at all. I just kind of briefly went through it. So today, we're focusing on the jailer. And it says, the jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." Then the jailer called for the lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Now, notice here there's kind of a change of location. Suddenly we're at the jailer's house. They spoke the word of the Lord to him, or his family is there with them. That's another option. Suddenly, they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all the household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. So let's zoom in for a second on this Philippian jailer today. So basically we know that he was a jailer, and because of that he was probably ex-military, because the people who were jailers were often retired army soldiers, army veterans from the Roman army. And so you can picture him being maybe in his 40s, his early 50s, and as an ex-soldier, he would have been really good at being a jailer because he knew about weapons and defense and keeping someone prisoner and following orders. All these things would have made him a good jailer, so that was kind of a common practice. And so because of his military background, though, there are even some evidences of it in the text that I won't get into, the jailer was probably a pretty brutal person. And so one thing I think is really cool is in Acts chapter 16 is there's this amazing cross-section of people that are looked at as basically like three, I don't know what you call it, like three case studies. And basically the first is a woman named Lydia. We talked about her on Mother's Day. Good news for women. And Lydia was an affluent cosmopolitan business owner. And then the second person is who I just mentioned, a slave girl. And she was mentally deranged, spiritually oppressed, marginalized, and being exploited by her masters. And then now we have the Philippian jailer. And this is really interesting because he's like a blue-collar dude, kind of a tough guy, and ex-military. And these three people couldn't be more different. I mean, it's kind of like you have upper class, lower class, and now middle class, if you will. You know, there's different races and genders, and they're different socially and spiritually. And so one is that alone, that cross-section says Jesus is good news for all people. And by the way, last week in this service, I stood at the back of the room worshiping before I came to preach, and I looked around at the back of this crowd, and I was like, there is some beautiful diversity at Momentum. I mean, it was man, woman, Hispanic, Asian, black, white, all ages. I mean, just it was a beautiful diversity. And that we see a cross-section of that in Acts chapter 16. So 2009, years ago now, Momentum met in Cinemark Theater in Valley View. And we were doing a series called The Man Series. And I remember it was a series that was about the life of Abraham in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And our point with that series, which was really cool and a lot of fun, but basically the point was to challenge men to put their families and their communities and their church on their backs and say, man, I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to take responsibility, and I'm going to, as a servant, try to carry the load. And like, I need to put because I kept saying to the church, the American church largely runs on women, if you will. I was like, I mean, the women are the key volunteers. Like, sure, often the hired guy who runs his mouth up front is a man, but for the most part, churches survive because women put the church on their backs. Can I get an amen? Okay, so let's just make that clear. So in the Man series, I was like, dudes, we need as much masculine spirit in the church as we have feminine spirit. We need both. They're both vital. Well, I had one woman who has been a part of Momentum up till recently where she moved away. So it wasn't like she left because of the series, but she goes, man, when you announced the Man series, I have to admit, I was a little worried. I was like, what is this going to be? Like, I don't understand. We already live in a male-dominated society. Why are you doing the Man series? And so she said, I was nervous. I was hesitant. She said, but once you started launching into that series, she said, I thought, wow, like this is powerful and this is so needed. She said, I now see the power of having the men in our church and in our community see their value and hear it from someone and be encouraged and be challenged to get in the game or stay in the game if they're one of the few, and to join women in sacrificing and leadership in the church. And honestly, that's kind of what I hope will happen again today. So I understand if your guard's up a little bit, but at the same time, I think it's funny that, you know, at Mother's Day are like, good news for women, and everybody's like, yeah! And then when you say, good news for men, people are like, what? What do you mean by that, right? Is that what you feel? No? No? Okay, cool. Because I feel like that's what society feels like in general, is that like, wait, what do you mean by good news for men? Does that mean put women down? No. And so I want you to see three pieces of good news for men out of the story today. The first is this. Every man's life has value. That's good news. Okay, when the supernatural earthquake burst the prison doors open and the jailer is about to kill himself, the jailer, you have to understand, lives in a shame-honor culture. And if you're a jailer and you're in charge of guarding something, if that prisoner escapes, the penalty for you is your life. You are executed if prisoners escape on your watch. So that's why he's about to take his own life, and he lives in a shame-honor culture. But Paul sees the value of every human life, and he leaps into action on behalf of this man. And Paul says, wait a minute, we're all here. Like, not only are Paul and Silas here, but they still have, the prisoners are in there still. And he says, we're all here. Don't harm yourself. And the message here is really, there is still purpose for your life. There's a reason for you to live. There's more story for you to live out. God's not done with you yet, is the message here. Don't harm yourself. And really, at the risk of sounding super dramatic, I know, I would like to say the same thing to men who are listening today. It's just very simply this. You are valuable. You are extremely valuable. God has a purpose for your life and more in store for your story. And the purpose for your life, it's not to die. It is to die to self and to live abundantly in Christ, though. And so, as overly dramatic as it might sound, Men, you are valuable. Don't harm yourself. You have value. You are so needed. I watched a powerful TEDx talk. I think it was a couple years ago, but it was from 2017. And it's by a documentary filmmaker named Cassie J. And the title caught my eye, and I was just like, this isn't even usually kind of like what I would be interested in watching, but this sounds interesting, and I clicked on it. The title was A Feminist Comes to Terms with the Men's Rights Movement. I'd never even heard of there being a men's rights movement. And that might just be my ignorance because I really try not to turn on the news ever. So that might just be me. But she said this. She said, in 2013, I decided to meet my enemies. I was 27-year-old, an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and a proud feminist. I was determined to expose the dark underbelly of the men's rights movement. At that point, all I knew of the men's rights movement from what I read online is that it's a misogynistic hate group actively working against women's equality. She said, for 1 year, I traveled North America meeting leaders and followers of the men's rights movement. And she said, as I spent hours upon hours interviewing person after person, she said, I never once heard them, I was waiting and anticipating, never once heard them say something where they were advocating for less for women or to lower women or anything like that, but it was about places where men's rights were overlooked. And she said, I kept waiting, anticipating, but it just never kept going. The misogyny just never was popping up. And she was like, that's so strange. And so she went on to say, present day, after years of researching and fact-checking, there's no denying that there are many human rights issues that uniquely or disproportionately affect men. Now, again, listening to this TED Talk, I was leaning forward in my chair like, what? What are you talking about? And she listed, these are just some, paternity fraud, like a woman allowing a man to believe the child is his or not letting a man know that she has a child that's his. So paternity fraud, workplace deaths, war deaths, sentencing disparity, life expectancy, child custody, child support, criminal court bias, boys falling behind in education, homelessness, veteran issues. Those are just some of the issues where she talked about the disparity of how men were treated. And one powerful example she gave that I thought was powerful, she said, men are roughly 78% of all suicides throughout the world. And I was like, wow. And she said, me as a feminist, I was like, yeah, but women attempt it more. And she was like, wait a minute, this isn't a competition. And she's like, that's not a competition anyone wants to be a part of. And so Cassie J went on to say, man, people think men have all the rights and power and privilege and that these issues, she said, but these issues deserve to be acknowledged. You know, even if men are more privileged, and it has been a dominated society by men. She's like, but these issues deserve attention and to be acknowledged. And then she said, just to make it clear, I didn't agree with everything they said. She said, but I found it very valuable to listen to them and see the world through their eyes. And then here's what I thought was the most interesting. She said, it's no secret now that I no longer call myself a feminist, but I must clarify, I am not anti-feminist, she said. I still support women's rights, and now I care about men's rights as well. Now, I just thought that was so fascinating, and my takeaway from that was something I had been thinking for a few years before that, and that is just simply this. To be pro-women, you don't have to be anti-men. And let's flip that. To be pro-men, you don't have to be anti-women. In fact, any philosophy that pits one group of people against another group of people just isn't helpful. It just isn't. And so you could be pro-women, you can be pro-men, you can be pro-black, you can be pro-police officer, you don't have to be pit against another group to say, I love and value black people, I love and value women, I love and value Hispanics and Asians. You don't have to choose sides. Value all of them. Does that sound good? Love all of them. Jesus loved all of them. He poured into male disciples, but valued women in a way that shocked the culture around him. What are you doing talking to that woman at the well? Shut up. You know, that's in the original Greek. Jesus saying to the disciples, shut up. I'll give you one of these. You know, that kind of thing. Jesus is Italian suddenly. Hey, what are you doing? I'll give you some of this, you know. Whatever, now I've offended the Italians. Be pro-Italian. Be pro-Italian. But yeah, Jesus is good news for all people. In fact, I think it's funny. We would agree, misogyny, bad. That is terrible. It's in our art, it's in our culture, it's in our hip hop, it's in so much misogyny. But misandry is like a word that we've never heard, which that's the kind of the other side, the other word for hatred, dislike, distrust of men. And man, I feel like that's more and more encouraged in society. Men suck. Men don't have value. Men are awful. They're all terrible. Like, that is kind of the feeling generally in society that a lot of men feel. In fact, I think society is getting louder and louder with the message that men are irrelevant and that they aren't needed in society anymore. And I've heard multiple times lately hearing people say, certainly men are not needed to raise kids anymore. They're not even needed in the equation. And I'm like, may I chime in on that for just a second? Every bit of data that we have says children need their fathers. Every bit of data that we have. And so I understand there are situations, heartbreaking situations, where someone has lost a father or the father chooses not to be in it and all that. But the data shows children need their fathers. Fatherlessness is an epidemic in our country. 40% of us grew up without daddies. 40%. It's an epidemic. The effects of that are catastrophic. Nearly 30 years ago, leading child psychologist Michael Lamb, he reminded us fathers are the forgotten contributor to child development. And so children with involved fathers have stronger cognitive and motor skills, elevated physical and mental health. They become better problem solvers with the mom and the dad in their lives and are more confident, curious, and empathetic. So I just want to say that to say, men, you are valuable. Your kids need you. Your families need you. Your community needs you. Your church needs you. Your Mo group needs you. That neighbor who's struggling needs you. Men, you are valuable. So men, you have great value in God's church. And that's good news for me to be reminded of. That's good news for men in general. Second thing is this. Men find new compassion through Jesus. Okay? Yes, there have been many terrible, brutish, abusive, none of that is good, men in history. But this jailer, who's probably a pretty brutal person, sees two things in Paul and Silas. One, in the face of suffering, he sees peace and joy instead of anger and cursing. And the second thing is, in the face of cruelty, he sees kindness and forgiveness. That's what he experiences. Bible scholar William Barclay years ago said, there was never a grudge in Paul's nature. He could preach to the very man who had fastened him in stocks. He was quite willing to open the door of salvation to the jailer who had shut the door of the prison on him. And so this jailer intuitively knew that these two guys had something that he didn't have, and he saw the power of God in the earthquake and in their lives by how they responded with kindness and compassion. Ultimately, that led the jailer to Jesus, and Jesus gave him a new compassion. The jailer washes their wounds, probably at a well in the prison courtyard. And then it says that he brought him into his own home and he set a meal before him. The good news makes you compassionate, okay? It makes you compassionate. A couple years ago, I preached a message on Jesus' teaching, which is one of my favorite little sayings of Jesus. Blessed are the meek, which people misunderstand today, and they think weak is a synonym. It's a synonym. Okay, so they think it's weak, but it's not. It's not at all. Meekness in the Greek is power or strength under control. And the picture is like a bridled horse, like a wild stallion who's powerful, but it takes the bit and it becomes useful for a purpose. And that energy, that strength is channeled for good. And so the idea of blessed are the meek is Jesus saying, blessed are you who are strength under control. And that's a powerful thing in the hands of God. And so a couple years ago, I was preaching on that, and a big studly dude at Momentum came up to me, kind of teary-eyed and glassy-eyed, which I had not seen before. And he said, man, why couldn't you have preached that sermon X amount of years ago? He said, man, if I would have heard this back then, I think it would have saved my marriage. And I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but what I think he meant is that Jesus would have made a big difference in my marriage. If I learned Jesus' strength under control. Jesus was powerful, but he was under control. He was in submission to God. And so, man, if I had Jesus' compassion in my relationship and in my marriage, and that's just like the jailer. Like, I see that type of Christ-like compassion in Paul and Silas, that mercy, that reaction, and I want that, and Jesus gives a new compassion. So good news for men is just simply this. It's a process of you working together with God, but God's power, the gospel, can quench your anger. It can shrink your selfishness, and God's power can grow compassion in you for the people around you. That's good news for me. That's good news for my marriage. That's good news for men. Third final thing is this, is men find joy when they experience spiritual progress with their families. So now I'm speaking to married men or men with children, but in the early church, we often see the good news leading to joy and rejoicing. Like, people burst out with it. So for instance, in Acts chapter 8, two examples. Last week we talked about a guy named Philip preaching in a city in Samaria, and at the end it says there was great joy in the city. And then just a couple stories later, basically, same guy, Philip, in a sermon that we covered in the spring called Good News for a Black Man, he talks to an Ethiopian eunuch, and at the end of that, he baptizes the Ethiopian guy, and then it says the Ethiopian went on his way rejoicing. Like, whoa, enthusiasm, let's go. He's pumped up, he's fired up. And so all of a sudden, joy is what happens. But in the case of the Philippian jailer, this is what it says. Paul and Silas spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in his house. Immediately, he and all his household were baptized. He was filled with joy. Why? Because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. And so the story implies that the members of his household were old enough to hear, believe, understand, conceive, and respond to the gospel of Jesus. And his faith gave him joy, but also his family's faith gave him joy. And so he had like a come to Jesus moment with his whole family. And he's like, man, they believe also. This is something we've experienced together. And so he was filled with joy. He doesn't keep it to himself. He gets his whole family involved. Bible scholar F.F. Bruce, who's a famous British scholar back in the day, he said this: the jailer bathed the wounds of the two men, Paul and Silas, probably at the well in the prison courtyard. Like I said, there too, he and his whole household were baptized. So it's kind of cool. The picture is like there's this well and there's this water, this bathtub of water, if you will, that he washes the wounds of these Christian men. And then like almost immediately afterward, he and his family are baptized. He washes their wounds, and then his sins are washed away. And he sees with joy his family, because of their faith, their sins being washed away. And so the challenge is, husbands and fathers, what if you tried to become, and what if you said, I want to become a positive catalyst for spiritual growth in my family? Or just in my peer group, among my friends. But what if you said, husbands and fathers, I want to try to be a positive catalyst for spiritual growth in my family? Like, if you were the one that said, if it's not already initiated, let's make sure we get to church. Let's make sure we get to Mo Group. Let's serve. Let's be generous. Because again, let me be really honest. It's usually the woman who's being the catalyst for that, right? And I know a lot of Christian women who say, I wish my husband would be a catalyst for it too. Like, I wish with me, he would say, man, we need to worship together. We need to serve together. We need to be generous. And women usually celebrate that, like, yes, he also too wants to be a catalyst for spiritual growth in our home. And what if you, as a man, as a good, positive catalyst for spiritual growth in your home, what if you said, I'm going to do that through sacrifice? I'm going to do that through encouragement. I'm going to do that through service. Jesus was a servant leader. I'm going to do that through self-control, meekness, strength under control. I'm going to do it by leading by example. But also, here's the good news, guys. It's also by saying, I'm going to do it through owning my mistakes. I'm going to admit when I've blown it. And I'm going to own that. Or I'm going to acknowledge, man, I need God's grace so badly. And when I mess up, this is just an example. I need God's grace badly. I'm sorry I yelled at you. I lost it for a minute. I was really tired. I've had a long day, but I should not have taken it out on you. I'm really sorry. I blew it tonight. If you forgive me, let's try to start over again in the morning. And so, good news, verbally expressing, another way you can do is verbally expressing to your wife, to your kids, I love you, son. To verbally express, I love you, daughter. And just to say, I want my kids to learn that and to be a catalyst of that kind of love in my home. Brent Hansen, that Christian author, radio personality, who views himself as not an intimidating man. In the book, The Men That We Need, I think one of the most powerful parts of the book that I've read so far, in the foreword, he has a foreword written by his longtime friend, longtime producer, who happens to be a young black lady named Sherry Lynn. And I think that she's single. I don't know, though. But she writes this as his foreword, and man, it is good. Frankly, I got allergies when I was reading it again. And so she said this, when I met Brent Hansen, a guy who plays the flute and was president of the Illinois Student Librarians Association, I didn't quite know what to make of him. Then one evening I went to his house for dinner. We had only been working together for maybe a week. I was in his home less than 10 minutes when I saw it. I saw what I believed to be the true definition of a man. It wasn't him running around fixing things or watching sports. It was the way his daughter and his wife looked at him. There it was. There was love, yes. There was adoration, sure. But there was something I consider infinitely more valuable: safety. They were safe with him. Whew. Like, when I read that, I teared up. And I also realized, like, man, that's really been my vision all my life. I've always wanted to have a wife and maybe a daughter, which I've been blessed with, that would feel safe with me. And not just like physically, like we know dad's not going to hurt us. I know my husband's not going to hurt me. That, yes, but not just that my wife can feel safety when I travel and go speak and she knows that our marriage is safe. Just that safety that knows when I blow it, I'm going to try to be self-aware and admit it and suck it up and say, that was my fault. I'm the one, I escalated that. I blew it. And that kind of safety. And Sherry went on to say, it's almost, in the almost decade that we've worked together, I've had countless meals and events with the Hansens. And the way they look at him hasn't changed. It is clear. He is still their protector. And Sherry says one of the most powerful things next. She says, I hounded him to write this book. It's a woman saying, I see that a man like that submitted to Jesus, meek, strength under control, he's good news to me. To see that, to work with that, and no, he's not going to be creepy with me in the studio and on the road. And she even mentions, no matter what woman came up to him for book signings, he treated them all with respect as if his wife and his daughter were sitting there with him. I've seen it for 10 years, she says. That's good news to Sherry. And for Brent Hansen, that quirky, unintimidating man, self-described, that strength, that compassion, that humility, that safety comes from being a follower, a student, a disciple of Jesus. It comes from God. And Brent Hansen is a positive catalyst for spiritual growth in his family, and I guarantee it's one of his greatest joys, and I guarantee that he senses, I was made for this. This is made to be one of my top priorities easily in my entire lifetime. This is what I'm made for. In fact, in his book, one of the things he says is true masculinity is about taking responsibility. I know so many women who say that is the kind of man that I want. I want a man who will take responsibility. Like the image of a man is taking responsibility. The image of an immature man or a boy even is blaming. And you see it in Genesis chapter 3 with the first sin, Adam and Eve, they disobey God, and Adam starts blaming. He even blames Eve for his sin. He's blaming. He's not taking responsibility for what he did and owning it. And so just a tough question is to say, what does it look like for you to take responsibility for the spiritual trajectory of yourself and of your family? And I got to tell you, for me, man, as a man, as a husband, as a father, as a leader, and I know so many of you are with me on this, I have no greater joy than when I see my kids worshiping Jesus. on Sunday morning, serving people throughout the week, being generous and giving some of their money earned to God and to their friends to be generous. Like that stuff just makes me so like filled with joy, like the Philippian Jailer, like, man, that fills me with joy. But I have no greater goal, wish, or prayer than leaving this world and knowing that my wife and kids will follow Jesus on earth, and then one day eventually we will be reunited in God's presence in the heavenly city. That is my goal as a father. I want to do everything I can to ensure that that happens to the best of my ability and the best of my control. Last thing, and I'm done. A guy named Jordan Peterson. Some of you have probably heard of him. He's become really famous. He's a Canadian clinical psychologist, professor emeritus at University of Toronto. He's also a public intellectual and a very controversial character. Depending on your politics and all that, Peterson is one of those guys that's like, I won't bow to political correctness. I have heard of him a few years ago, but I've never really listened to anything by him. So you got to understand that. If you're like, politics are a big deal to me, they're not a big deal to me. So you might be like, I hate that guy. Okay, if it's political, I don't know anything about that. But I listened to this video for the first time a month ago. He released a video called Message to the Christian Churches. I was like, huh? Hey, I've heard of that guy. That's strange. What would he have to say to churches? He calls himself an agnostic. I don't think anyone that I know who's a biblical Christian would say, yeah, he's a biblical Christian. I don't think that would be the case, a historical Christian. So it was interesting that he has this video, Message to Christian Churches. I don't agree with everything in the video, so again, you go watch it. Oh, this is Dan. No, it's not Dan. Shut up, okay? Listen to what I'm saying, people. The end of it, though, wow. This is what he says at the end. He says to the Christian churches, invite the young men back. Say literally to those young men, you are welcome here. If no one else wants what you have to offer, we do. We want to call you to the highest purpose of your life. We want your time and energy and effort and will and your goodwill. We want to work with you to make things better, to produce life more abundant for you and for your wife and children and for your community and your country and the world. He said, so, tell them, we have our problems in the Christian church. We are sometimes too abundant, sometimes corrupt. We're outdated. And so he says, so join us. We'll help fix you. You can help fix us, and together we'll aim up. And he says, invite young men. He says, put up a billboard. Say, young men are welcome here. Print some flyers and put them in a box by the billboard. Signal the existence of those flyers with an arrow with the words, more information about attending here. To those who have never been in a church, tell them exactly what to do, how to dress, when to show up, who to contact, and most importantly, what they can do. Ask more, not less, of those you are inviting. Ask more of them than anyone ever has. Remind them who they are in the deepest sense and help them become that. And I so agreed with that of like, yes, young men, you are welcome here. And old men, you are welcome here. Mike Bonanno, our sax player, came up and was like, thank you for saying that at the end. I said, get out of here, Mike. And I shoved him down. Middle-aged men, you are welcome here. Black men, you are welcome here. Asian men, you are welcome here. Hispanic men, you are welcome here. White men, you are welcome here. Middle-class, blue-collar men, you are welcome here. White-collar men, you are welcome here. Men who feel like, I'm not that masculine picture of what a man really is. Oh, there's good news. You probably don't feel like that because maybe you didn't have a dad. You're one of the 40%. Didn't have a dad to teach you how to fix things or to throw a football or whatever. You are welcome here. The Church of Jesus is good news for men. Let's pray.